Marcus Thompson stood 6 feet 8 inches tall, with hands that could palm a basketball like most people hold an orange. His shoulders stretched wide enough to block doorways, and his voice carried the deep rumble of distant thunder. Yet when Sarah Martinez first met him in that cramped coffee shop on Elm Street, she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch not fear, but recognition of someone who understood what it meant to take up too much space in a world that preferred you small. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She had been sitting in the corner booth, laptop open, fingers trembling slightly as she typed her resignation letter from Henderson & Associates law firm. The bruise on her wrist, carefully concealed beneath a silk scarf, still ached from 3 nights ago when David had grabbed her during another one of his episodes. When Marcus accidentally bumped her table while maneuvering his massive frame between the chairs, Sarah flinched so violently that her coffee cup rattled against the saucer. "I'm sorry," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible despite its natural depth. "I didn't mean to startle you." That whisper, soft as silk, gentle as morning rain, would become the first thread in a tapestry of healing that neither of them saw coming. The morning Marcus Thompson received his termination notice from Steelworks Manufacturing, the sky over. Pittsburgh hung gray and heavy, mirroring the weight settling in his chest. 23 years he had worked in that factory, ever since graduating high school at 17, with shoulders already broader than most grown men. His supervisor, Chuck Williams, couldn't meet his eyes when he handed over the pink slip. "It's nothing personal, Marcus," Chuck muttered, fidgeting with his clipboard. "Company's downsizing. You know how it is." But Marcus did know how it was. He had watched the younger, smaller men get promoted while he remained on the factory floor. He had seen the way people stepped aside when he walked down hallways, not out of respect but from an instinctive fear of his size. At 42 years old, Marcus had learned that being large in a world designed for average-sized people meant being perpetually misunderstood. His apartment on Riverside Drive reflected this reality. Reinforced furniture, custom-made bed frame, doorways he had to duck through daily. The loneliness lived in those adaptations, in the way restaurant chairs groaned under his weight, in the startled looks from strangers who encountered his towering presence unexpectedly. His mother, Eleanor Thompson, had passed away 8 months earlier, taking with her the only person who had ever called him gentle without irony. The unemployment office on 5th Street buzzed with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look sickly. Marcus folded himself into a plastic chair clearly not designed for someone his size, knees bumping against the small attached desk. The caseworker, Janet Rodriguez, barely glanced up from her computer screen when she processed his information. "Any skills besides factory work?" she asked, fingers clicking rapidly across the keyboard. "I restore old books," Marcus said quietly, "in my spare time." Janet paused, finally looking at him directly. The admission surprised even him. He rarely shared this passion with anyone. In the evenings, after his factory shifts, Marcus would carefully repair damaged spines, rebind loose pages, and restore forgotten stories to their former glory. His massive hands, which seemed clumsy and dangerous to the outside world, could thread delicate needles and handle century-old paper with the precision of a surgeon. "There's a position at the downtown library," Janet said, scrolling through job listings. "They need someone for their rare books collection, restoration, and archival work. Interested?" 3 days later, Marcus found himself walking through the grand entrance of the Carnegie Public Library, its marble columns making even him feel small. The head librarian, Robert Chun, seemed nervous during their meeting, his eyes darting frequently to Marcus's hands as they discussed the position requirements. "The books in our collection are irreplaceable," Robert explained, leading Marcus through the climate-controlled rare books room. "Some date back to the 1400s. They require delicate handling." Marcus nodded, understanding the unspoken concern. He had faced this doubt countless times, people assuming his size equated to clumsiness, that his strength meant he couldn't possess gentleness. Without asking permission, Marcus approached a damaged 1920s first edition sitting on the restoration table. He examined the torn spine with careful eyes, then demonstrated how he would realign the binding. His movements precise and reverent. Robert watched in fascination as Marcus's large fingers navigated the delicate repair with impossible grace. When can you start? The library became Marcus's sanctuary. In the quiet basement restoration room, surrounded by the musty smell of old leather and paper, he found peace. His co-workers, mostly graduate students and retired professors, initially kept their distance, but gradually warmed to his quiet presence and obvious expertise. Dr. Patricia Hoffman, the collection's curator, became his first real friend in years. "You have gifted hands," she told him one afternoon, watching him carefully remove water damage from a 1600s medical manuscript. "There's healing in what you do." Marcus had never thought of his work as healing, but Patricia's words resonated with something deep inside him. Each restored book represented a rescued voice, a saved story. In mending broken spines and torn pages, perhaps he was also mending something within himself. It was during his third week at the library that Marcus first noticed her. Sarah Martinez arrived every Tuesday and Thursday during his lunch break, always choosing the small table near the philosophy section. She moved with the careful precision of someone perpetually aware of their surroundings, her dark eyes scanning the room before settling into her chair. She wore long sleeves even on warm days and kept her auburn hair styled to frame her face in a way that suggested both beauty and concealment. Sarah worked as a family attorney at Henderson & Associates, specializing in divorce and custody cases. The irony wasn't lost on her, helping other women escape toxic relationships while remaining trapped in her own. David Kellerman, her live-in boyfriend of 2 years, had slowly eroded her confidence through subtle manipulations and occasional outbursts that left her walking on eggshells in her own home. The library had become her refuge, a place where she could research legal precedents for her cases, while also browsing self-help books she was too embarrassed to check out. She had noticed the giant man who worked in the basement, impossible not to, given his commanding presence, but had never spoken to him. Something about his gentleness intrigued her, the way he moved so carefully through the world, despite his obvious physical power. Marcus began timing his trips to the main floor to coincide with Sarah's visits. He told himself it was a coincidence, but deep down he knew better. There was something about her that drew him, perhaps the way she held herself with such quiet dignity, or the sadness he glimpsed in her eyes when she thought no one was looking. He began leaving small gestures in her vicinity, straightening the chairs at her preferred table, ensuring fresh flowers appeared in the nearby window display, quietly replacing burnt-out reading lamps with brighter ones. Sarah noticed these subtle improvements but never connected them to the gentle giant who worked downstairs. She assumed the library staff simply took excellent care of the space. The small kindnesses became part of what made the library feel safe, a contrast to the tension that awaited her at home where David's moods dictated the atmosphere of their shared apartment. One Thursday evening in October, Sarah arrived at the library later than usual, having stayed late at the firm to avoid going home. David had been drinking again the night before, and their argument about her attitude had escalated until she locked herself in the bathroom, listening to him punch the wall outside. The bruise on her shoulder, hidden beneath her blazer, served as a reminder of how close his anger had come to targeting her directly. The library was nearly empty by the time she settled at her usual table. Marcus had finished his restoration work for the day, but lingered in the main area, ostensibly organizing returned books, but actually hoping to catch another glimpse of the mysterious woman who had begun occupying his thoughts. When he saw her, wiping away tears while reading what appeared to be legal documents, something inside him shifted. He approached slowly, the way one might approach a wounded animal, with respect for the pain and awareness that sudden movements could cause flight. Sarah sensed his presence before she saw him, that particular awareness that comes from living with unpredictable danger. She looked up, startled, and for a moment they simply regarded each other across the space between their worlds. "Are you all right?" Marcus asked, his voice pitched so low and soft that she had to strain to hear it. The question, asked with such genuine concern, nearly broke her composure entirely. When was the last time someone had asked about her well-being without wanting something in return? When had anyone looked at her with such uncomplicated kindness? "I'm fine," she said automatically, the response so ingrained it came out without thought. Marcus nodded, accepting the lie because he understood the need for protective barriers. "I'm Marcus," he said simply. "I work downstairs in restoration." "Sarah," she hesitated, then added, "I've seen you around." "You're very quiet." "I try to be," Marcus replied. "Libraries deserve whispers." Something in his tone suggested he wasn't just talking about respecting quiet spaces. Sarah found herself studying his face, weathered but kind, with brown eyes that seemed to hold depths of unspoken understanding. Here was a man who clearly knew something about moving carefully through the world, about the need to make oneself smaller despite occupying significant physical space. "What kind of books do you restore?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. Marcus's face lit up with an enthusiasm that transformed his entire appearance. "All kinds. Right now I'm working on a collection of letters from Civil War soldiers to their wives. The paper is so fragile it's almost transparent, but the words—" He paused, searching for the right description. "The words are still full of love, even after all this time." Sarah felt something stir in her chest at the way he spoke about preserving love letters, the reverence in his voice for connections that had survived decades of separation and loss. "That sounds beautiful," she said softly. They talked for another 20 minutes about books, about the city's history, about small things that felt enormous in their careful exchange. When the library's closing announcement echoed through the space, Sarah realized she had forgotten about David's inevitable anger at her late arrival, forgotten about the tension waiting at home. For 20 precious minutes, she had simply been a woman talking to a man who seemed to understand the value of speaking softly in a world full of noise. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As they walked toward the exit together, Marcus slowed his naturally long stride to match her smaller steps. The gesture wasn't lost on Sarah, who was accustomed to men who expected her to keep up with their pace, their needs, their demands. This small consideration felt like an unexpected gift. Outside, under the amber glow of street lamps, they paused at the sidewalk where their paths would diverge. Marcus wanted to ask if he could walk her home, wanted to ensure she arrived safely wherever she was going, but something in her posture suggested that such an offer might be unwelcome or even dangerous for reasons he couldn't understand. "I hope to see you again," he said instead, his words carried away by the October wind. Sarah nodded, clutching her purse a little tighter as she prepared to return to the apartment where David would be waiting with questions about her whereabouts and mood that would set the tone for the rest of the evening. "Tuesday," she said. "I'm usually here on Tuesdays." Marcus watched her walk away, noting the way she seemed to grow smaller with each step, as if preparing to fold herself into a space too confining for her spirit. He didn't yet understand the nature of her careful movements, the reason behind her long sleeves and startled reactions, but something in his heart recognized a kindred spirit, someone else who had learned to navigate the world by making themselves less threatening, less noticeable, less present than their natural instincts desired. That night, in his apartment overlooking the river, Marcus found himself unable to concentrate on his evening reading. Instead, he thought about Sarah's hands, the way her fingers had trembled slightly when she turned the pages of her legal documents, the careful way she had arranged her sleeves to ensure coverage, the barely visible tension in her shoulders. That spoke of someone perpetually braced for impact. Miles away, in the apartment she shared with David on the south side of town, Sarah sat at her kitchen table staring at her phone. David had passed out on the couch after finishing a six-pack and ranting about her disrespectful late arrival. The silence felt precious and temporary, she knew. He would wake up in a few hours with a headache and renewed grievances about her behavior, but for now, in the quiet darkness, she allowed herself to think about Marcus, his impossibly gentle voice, the way he had approached her with such careful respect, the light in his eyes when he spoke about preserving love letters written by soldiers to their wives. She wondered what it would be like to be loved with such reverence, to have someone handle her heart with the same delicate care he showed those fragile, century-old pages. The thought scared her almost as much as it thrilled her. Sarah had forgotten what it felt like to be treated with gentleness, to have someone consider her comfort before their own convenience. David's version of love involved possession and control, loud demands and louder silences designed to punish her for imagined infractions. Marcus represented something different, a quiet strength that didn't need to prove itself through dominance, a gentleness that came from understanding rather than weakness. The contrast made her current situation feel even more suffocating, but it also planted a seed of hope she hadn't felt in months. Tuesday couldn't come fast enough. The following Tuesday arrived with an early winter chill that made the library's warmth feel like an embrace. Marcus had spent the morning working on a damaged Shakespeare folio, but his concentration kept drifting to the clock on the basement wall. At 12:47 p.m., he heard the familiar sound of the main entrance opening, followed by light footsteps across the marble floor. His pulse quickened with an anticipation he hadn't felt since high school. Sarah appeared at her usual table, carrying a different energy than the week before. She moved with less of the careful tension that had marked their first conversation. Though Marcus's trained eye noticed, she still scanned the room before settling down. Today she wore a navy sweater that brought out the green flecks in her brown eyes, and when she smiled at him across the reading area, something inside his chest expanded like a balloon, filling with warm air. "How are the Civil War letters?" she asked when he approached, her voice carrying genuine interest. Marcus pulled out the chair across from her, his movements deliberate and slow, heartbreaking and beautiful. One soldier wrote to his wife about dreaming of her voice calling his name. Said it was the only sound that could wake him peacefully. He paused, studying Sarah's face. "I wonder sometimes if she kept writing to him after the war ended, or if some conversations are meant to live forever in whispers." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks at the poetry in his words. David's communication consisted mainly of complaints and demands. When had anyone last spoken to her about dreams and forever? "Do you think they found each other again?" "The lucky ones did," Marcus replied. "But some kinds of love survive even when the lovers don't. Every time someone reads those letters, their voices speak again." They fell into an easy rhythm of conversation about books, history, and the peculiar magic of preserved words. Marcus shared stories from his restoration work, the cookbook filled with family recipes and handwritten notes that revealed 3 generations of Sunday dinners, the diary of a frontier woman whose courage leaped off pages softened by decades of handling. Sarah found herself describing cases from her law practice, the family she helped navigate divorce proceedings, the children caught between parents who had forgotten how to speak kindly to each other. "It must be difficult," Marcus observed, "spending your days helping relationships end." "Sometimes," Sarah admitted. "But occasionally I help someone escape a situation that was destroying them. Those cases make the sad ones worthwhile." She didn't mention that her expertise in recognizing emotional abuse came from personal experience, or that she often saw her own reflection in the haunted eyes of clients seeking freedom from partners who had slowly eroded their sense of self-worth. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Tommy Sullivan, one of Marcus's younger co-workers from the restoration department. Tommy bounded up to their table with the enthusiasm of a golden retriever, seemingly oblivious to the intimate atmosphere he was interrupting. "Marcus, there you are. Dr. Hoffman wants to show you that manuscript that came in from the estate sale. Some kind of medieval illuminated text, really incredible stuff." Tommy's eyes shifted to Sarah with barely concealed curiosity. "Oh, hi there. I'm Tommy. You're the regular Tuesday lady, right?" Sarah felt her cheeks flush at being identified as a regular, but Marcus's gentle introduction put her at ease. "Tommy, this is Sarah. Sarah, Tommy is our resident expert on binding techniques." "Nice to meet you officially," Tommy said, then turned back to Marcus with poorly suppressed excitement. "Seriously though, you've got to see this manuscript. The gold leaf work is insane, and there's this weird symbol on every page that no one can identify." Marcus glanced at Sarah with an apologetic expression. "Would you mind if I go?" Sarah said, smiling at his obvious eagerness. "Medieval mysteries don't wait." As Marcus unfolded his considerable height from the chair, Sarah caught herself watching the fluid grace with which he moved despite his size. There was something mesmerizing about the way he navigated space, always aware of his impact on his surroundings, always careful not to overwhelm or intimidate. She had never known a man who moved through the world with such considerate awareness. Marcus hesitated at the edge of her table. "Will you be here when I get back?" The question carried more weight than its simple words suggested. Sarah heard the underlying vulnerability, the fear that she might disappear during his absence, like some beautiful dream interrupted by obligation. "I'll be here," she promised. Downstairs in the climate-controlled vault, Marcus tried to focus on the illuminated manuscript Tommy had discovered. But his mind kept drifting upstairs to Sarah. The medieval text was indeed extraordinary, each page adorned with intricate drawings of fantastical creatures surrounding blocks of Latin text, the mysterious symbol Tommy mentioned appearing in the bottom corner of every illustration. "Earth to Marcus," Dr. Hoffman said, amusement in her voice. "You seem distracted today." Marcus felt heat creep up his neck. "Sorry, just thinking about the restoration approach." Patricia Hoffman had been observing human nature for 63 years, the last 30 of which she spent managing a rare books collection that attracted scholars, researchers, and the occasionally love-struck. She had noticed Marcus's recent changes, the extra attention to his appearance, the way he timed his movements around the Tuesday and Thursday visitor who had caught his attention. "She seems lovely," Patricia said casually, not looking up from the manuscript. "Who?" Marcus asked, but his unconvincing tone made Tommy snort with laughter. "Come on, Marcus. The whole library has noticed you two talking. It's actually pretty. Cute, in a giant teddy bear kind of way." Marcus cringed at being the subject of workplace gossip, but Patricia's gentle smile reassured him. "There's nothing wrong with connection, Marcus. You've been alone too long as it is." The conversation made Marcus uncomfortable in ways he couldn't articulate. Throughout his adult life, he had accepted loneliness as the price of his physical presence in a world designed for smaller people. The few women who had shown interest in him over the years either fetishized his size or quickly grew intimidated by the practical challenges of dating someone who required custom-made everything. He had convinced himself that solitude was preferable to the inevitable disappointment of failed connections. But Sarah felt different. She didn't stare at his hands or make jokes about needing a ladder to kiss him. She looked at his face when they spoke, listened to his words with genuine interest, and responded to his gentleness rather than reacting to his size. The possibility that someone might actually see him, not just his imposing physical presence, but the careful man who existed within it, terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. Upstairs, Sarah was having her own moment of revelation. She had spent the past hour reading the same paragraph of case law over and over, unable to concentrate on anything except the memory of Marcus's voice describing love letters that survived decades of separation. When was the last time someone had spoken to her about love with such reverence? When had anyone looked at her with the kind of gentle attention Marcus showed when she talked about her work? Her phone buzzed with a text from David. "Where are you? Thought you were coming home for lunch." Sarah's stomach clenched. She had forgotten about David's expectation that she would spend her lunch break at their apartment, listening to him complain about his job while she made sandwiches, and nodded sympathetically. The library had become such a refuge that she had briefly forgotten about the minefield of his moods waiting at home. She typed back, "At the library, research for a case. Home tonight as usual." The response came immediately, "Don't stay too late. We need to talk about your attitude lately." Sarah's hands began to shake as she read the message. Your attitude was David's code for any behavior that suggested independence or happiness that didn't directly involve him. He had been increasingly possessive over the past few months, questioning her late nights at work, her occasional dinners with colleagues, even her choice of clothing on days when she felt confident. She was staring at the phone, trying to craft a response that wouldn't provoke another argument when Marcus returned to the main floor. He took one look at her pale complexion and immediately recognized distress, though he couldn't identify its source. "Is everything all right?" he asked softly, sliding into the chair across from her with movements even more careful than usual. Sarah looked up at him, this gentle giant whose presence somehow made her feel safer rather than more vulnerable, and felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "Just work stress," she lied, slipping the phone into her purse before he could see David's message. Marcus sensed deception but didn't push. He had learned to recognize the careful boundaries people built around their pain, had constructed plenty of his own over the years. Instead, he offered a different kind of comfort. "The manuscript Tommy wanted to show me has this beautiful illustration of a woman reading by candlelight," he said, his voice taking on the gentle cadence he used when describing his restoration work. The artist painted tiny details in the margins: a sleeping cat at her feet, books stacked beside her chair, even a small window showing stars outside. You can tell he wanted to capture not just how she looked, but how peaceful she felt in that moment. Sarah found herself relaxing as Marcus painted the verbal picture, his words creating a sanctuary from the anxiety David's text had triggered. "It sounds like he understood something important about reading." "I think he understood something about safety," Marcus replied. "About creating spaces where you can exist without having to defend yourself or explain your right to be there." The comment hit too close to home, and Sarah felt her breath catch. Marcus noticed her reaction and wondered if he had said something wrong, but before he could ask, Sarah spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Do you ever feel like you're too much for the spaces you occupy?" The question revealed more than she intended, and Marcus understood that she was sharing something significant. "Every day," he answered honestly. "But I'm starting to think maybe the problem isn't that we're too much. Maybe it's that we've been trying to fit into spaces that are too small." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, both processing the weight of what had been shared. Around them, the library hummed with quiet activity students researching papers, elderly patrons browsing large print mysteries, children participating in story time in the corner reading area. The normalcy felt precious to Sarah, a reminder that peaceful coexistence was possible, that not every shared space had to be a battleground of competing needs and egos. "I should probably get back to work," Sarah finally said, though she made no move to pack up her things. "Of course," Marcus replied, but he didn't stand either. "Sarah, if you ever need someone to talk to, or if you just want to sit quietly while someone else handles the conversation, I'm a very good listener." The offer was made with such genuine kindness that Sarah felt something crack open inside her chest. She had forgotten what it felt like to have someone offer support without expectation, to have her emotional needs acknowledged without being made to feel burdensome or dramatic. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more deeply than he could possibly. No doubt as she gathered her belongings, Sarah realized that her hands had stopped shaking. The anxiety David's text had triggered was still there, but it felt manageable now, buffered by the memory of Marcus's gentle voice and the safety she felt in his presence. She wondered what it would be like to carry that feeling with her always. To have someone in her life whose first instinct was to comfort rather than criticize. Marcus watched her prepare to leave with the same careful attention he gave to fragile manuscripts. She seemed steadier now than when he had first returned from downstairs, but something in her posture still spoke of someone preparing to face an unpleasant reality. He wished he could offer more than words and listening ears, but understood that healing like restoration couldn't be rushed. "Thursday?" he asked as she shouldered her purse. "Thursday," Sarah confirmed, and this time her smile reached her eyes. After she left, Marcus remained at the table, thinking about their conversation and the way she had asked about feeling too. Much for the spaces they occupied. He recognized something in that question, a kindred understanding of what it meant to make yourself smaller to accommodate a world that seemed designed for different proportions. But where his challenge was physical size, hers seemed to be something else entirely, something that made her flinch at sudden movements and choose long sleeves even on warm days, the realization that Sarah might be struggling with something more serious than work stress settled in his stomach like a stone. Marcus had grown up with a father whose anger filled every room he entered, had learned to recognize the particular wariness of people who lived in proximity to unpredictable moods and potential violence. His mother had worn that same careful expression for years before his father finally left when Marcus turned 16. The possibility that someone might be hurting Sarah, that her gentle spirit might be under siege from forces beyond her control, stirred something protective in Marcus that he hadn't felt since his mother's death. But he also knew that healing required patience, trust, and above all, the freedom to move at one's own pace toward safety. For now, he could offer what he gave to damaged books: careful attention, gentle handling, and the promise that some stories were worth preserving no matter how long the restoration process took. Thursday couldn't come soon enough, but Marcus was learning that the most beautiful connections, like the most precious manuscripts, revealed their treasures slowly, one whispered word at a time. Thursday arrived wrapped in the first snow of the season, transforming Pittsburgh into a black and white photograph. Sarah stood at her office window on the 15th floor of the Henderson building, watching the flakes drift past like tiny messengers carrying secrets between earth and sky. Her reflection in the glass revealed the carefully applied concealer that hid the finger-shaped bruises on her neck, souvenirs from David's reaction to her disrespectful tone during their argument the night before the fight had started over. Something trivial: she had mentioned needing to work late on Friday for a deposition, but escalated when David accused her of using work as an excuse to avoid spending time with him. His grip on her throat had been brief, more intimidating than damaging, but it marked a dangerous escalation in his behavior. For the first time, Sarah found herself genuinely afraid of what might come next. Her colleague, Jennifer Walsh, knocked on the office door with a steaming cup of coffee and her usual maternal concern. Jennifer had been practicing family law for 20 years and possessed an uncanny ability to read between the lines of her colleagues' carefully constructed facades. "Rough night?" Jennifer asked, settling into the chair across from Sarah's desk. "Couldn't sleep," Sarah replied, which was technically true. She had spent most of the night lying rigidly beside David, listening to his breathing and wondering when he would wake up with renewed grievances about her behavior. Jennifer studied Sarah's face with the practiced eye of someone who had seen too many women learn to hide bruises with makeup. "Sarah, I hope you know that if you ever need someone to talk to about anything, my door is always open." The offer was made with such gentle directness that Sarah felt her throat tighten with unshed tears. Jennifer's kindness reminded her that other people lived in worlds where support was freely offered, where vulnerability didn't automatically invite exploitation. "I appreciate that," Sarah managed after Jennifer left. Sarah found herself counting the hours until her library visit with an urgency that surprised her. Marcus had become an anchor point in her week, a reminder that gentleness existed in forms she had almost forgotten. The thought of his quiet presence and careful words pulled her through the morning, like a rope thrown to someone drowning in slow motion. Meanwhile, Marcus was experiencing his own form of anticipation mixed with anxiety. He had spent the previous evening researching signs of domestic abuse, his suspicions about Sarah's situation crystallizing into cold certainty as he read through legal websites and support resources. The careful way she moved, her startled reactions to sudden sounds, the long sleeves that never quite seemed seasonally appropriate, everything pointed to someone living under the shadow of another person's anger. Dr. Hoffman found him in the restoration room at 11 a.m., staring at an open book without actually reading it. "You look like a man wrestling with difficult decisions," she observed. Marcus set down the magnifying glass he had been absently holding. "Patricia, if you suspected someone was in danger, but you weren't certain, and addressing it directly might make things worse for them, what would you do?" Patricia had spent decades navigating the complex territory of human relationships, both as a librarian dealing with patrons in crisis and as a woman who had once escaped her own troubled marriage. "You'd create safety first," she said without hesitation. "Make sure they knew they had options, had support, had somewhere to turn if they needed it. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can offer someone is simply knowing that they're not alone. And if offering help puts them in more danger, then you move very carefully, very slowly, and you let them set the pace. Healing can't be forced, Marcus. Neither can rescue." At 1:15 p.m., Sarah entered the library carrying tension in her shoulders like a physical weight. Marcus noticed immediately that something had shifted since Tuesday. She moved with the hyper-awareness of someone expecting an attack, and the scarf around her neck seemed more strategic than fashionable. When she sat down across from him, he could see the careful application of makeup that didn't quite hide the shadows under her eyes. "Hello," he said softly, his voice pitched even lower than usual. "Hi," Sarah replied, and Marcus heard exhaustion in that single syllable. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, Sarah gradually relaxing in the peaceful atmosphere of the library. Marcus had learned to read her moods like the condition of a damaged manuscript. Some days required delicate handling, others could withstand more substantial conversation. Today clearly called for gentleness. "I brought something to show you," Marcus said eventually, pulling a small leather-bound book from his jacket pocket. "It's a collection of Emily Dickinson's poems. First edition, 1890. Someone donated it last week." He opened the book carefully, revealing pages yellowed with age but still crisp enough to hold their secrets. "Listen to this one," he said, reading in his whispered voice. "I'm nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us. Don't tell. They'd advertise, you know." Sarah felt something stir in her chest at the words, at the way Marcus's gentle voice gave them new life. She understood something about invisible people, she said quietly. I think she understood that sometimes being overlooked is safer than being seen by the wrong eyes. Marcus replied, watching Sarah's face carefully. But she also knew that finding another nobody could make. "You feel like somebody again." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Sarah's phone ringing. She glanced at the screen and immediately tensed. David's name appeared like a summons she couldn't ignore. Marcus watched her internal struggle play out across her features before she answered. "Hi," she said, her voice instantly different, smaller, more careful. Marcus couldn't hear David's words, but he could hear the tone sharp, demanding. designed to put Sarah on the defensive. He watched her face grow paler with each passing second. "I'm at the library researching the Henderson case," she said. "Yes, the same library as Tuesday. No, David, I'm alone." "I don't understand why that matters." Marcus felt his hands clench. Involuntarily, as he listened to Sarah explain and justify her perfectly reasonable presence at a public library. The conversation lasted 3 agonizing minutes, Sarah's responses growing shorter and more apologetic as David's tone grew more aggressive. When she finally hung up, Sarah's hands were shaking. "I'm sorry," she said automatically. "He gets worried when—" "Sarah." Marcus's voice was so gentle it stopped her mid-sentence. "You don't need to explain anything to me." The simple statement, the absence of questions or judgment, nearly broke her composure entirely. Sarah had become so accustomed to justifying every decision, every moment away from David's oversight, that having someone accept her presence without explanation felt revolutionary. "He wants me to come home," she said, her voice barely audible. Marcus studied her face, seeing the fear she was trying to hide, the way her body seemed to be preparing for flight or submission. "Do you want to go home?" The question was asked so simply, so without pressure, that Sarah found herself considering it honestly for the first time in months. Did she want to return to the apartment where David would spend the evening dissecting her phone call, looking for evidence of deception or disrespect? Did she want to endure another night of walking on eggshells, measuring every word to avoid triggering his anger? "No," she whispered, the admission feeling both terrifying and liberating. Marcus nodded, accepting her truth without trying to fix it or minimize it. "Then stay," he said. "For as long as you want. We don't have to talk if you don't want to. I can just read, and you can just exist." The offer was so unexpected, so perfectly calibrated to what she needed, that Sarah felt tears begin to flow down her cheeks. When was the last time someone had asked what she wanted instead of telling her what she should do? When had anyone offered their presence as a gift rather than an obligation? Marcus reached into his pocket and produced a small package of tissues, placing them on the table within her reach but not forcing them on her. He had learned from his mother's experience that sometimes the most powerful support was simply witnessing someone's pain without trying to solve it. "I think I'm in trouble," Sarah said eventually, the words coming out in a rush as if speaking them quickly might lessen their impact. "I know," Marcus replied gently. "And I want you to know that whatever kind of trouble it is, you're not alone with it anymore." Sarah looked up at him through tear-blurred eyes, seeing not pity or panic but steady certainty. Here was someone offering solidarity without demanding details, support without conditions. The contrast to David's love, which required constant performance and perfect compliance, was so stark it made her dizzy. "I don't know how to get out," she admitted. "You don't have to figure that out today," Marcus said. "Right now you just have to know that getting out is possible, that you deserve to be safe. That someone who truly loves you would never make you afraid to speak your truth." They sat together as the afternoon snow continued falling outside, Sarah crying quietly while Marcus provided the kind of steady presence that healing required: patient, non-demanding, absolutely reliable. Other library patrons passed by their table, but Marcus's considerable bulk and protective posture created a private space where Sarah could fall apart without fear of judgment or interruption. Eventually, Sarah's tears subsided, leaving behind a clarity she hadn't felt in months. "David will be furious that I didn't come home when he called." "What usually happens when he's furious?" Marcus asked, dreading the answer but needing to understand the scope of Sarah's danger. Sarah hesitated, then pushed up the sleeves of her sweater, revealing the fading bruises on her wrists from the previous week. "Usually this," she said quietly. Marcus felt rage surge through him like molten metal, but he kept his voice steady and low. "Sarah, that's not love. That's not even anger. That's someone trying to own another person." "I know," she whispered. "But knowing doesn't make leaving easier." He controls our lease, our finances. He knows where I work, where my family lives. And he's not always like this. Sometimes he's the man I fell in love with, and I think maybe if I just try harder." Marcus recognized the trap that so many abuse victims fell into, the cycle of violence followed by remorse and promises, the gradual erosion of self-worth that made leaving seem impossible rather than inevitable. His mother had described the same pattern, the way her abuser would oscillate between cruelty and kindness until she forgot what normal treatment felt like. "The man you fell in love with," Marcus said carefully, "did he ever make you afraid to go to the library?" The question cut straight to the heart of Sarah's confusion. The David she had initially dated would never have demanded she justify her presence at a public building, would never have made her feel guilty for pursuing her own interests. That man had been replaced gradually by someone who required constant reassurance of her devotion, constant proof that she prioritized his needs above her own. "No," she admitted. "That man wanted me to be happy." "Then maybe the man you fell in love with doesn't exist anymore," Marcus suggested gently. "Maybe he was replaced by someone who needs to control you to feel secure. And maybe you deserve to be with someone who wants you to be happy more than they want you to be compliant." Sarah looked at Marcus, really looked at him, taking in his kind eyes, his careful posture, the way he spoke about love as if it should nurture rather than diminish. She tried to imagine David offering the kind of patient support Marcus had provided during her breakdown, tried to picture him responding to her tears with tissues and understanding rather than irritation and accusations. The image wouldn't form. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Of course you are," Marcus replied. "Fear is the rational response to being threatened. But you're stronger than your fear, Sarah. I can see it in how you've survived this long, in how you keep showing up for work and for yourself even when someone is trying to convince you that you're not worth protecting." His words penetrated the fog of self-doubt that David had spent 2 years cultivating, reaching the part of Sarah that remembered what it felt like to trust her own judgment. She had managed to build a successful legal career while navigating David's increasingly unreasonable demands that took strength she had forgotten she possessed. "If I leave," she said slowly, "where would I go? He'll look for me at work, at my sister's house." Marcus felt the weight of her trust in asking such practical questions, understanding that she was moving from denial into planning mode. "There are shelters, safe houses, legal protections. And there are people who specialize in helping women in your situation plan safe exits." "You seem to know a lot about this," Sarah observed. Marcus was quiet for a moment, deciding how much of his own history to share. "My father was like David," he said finally. "My mother stayed for 16 years because she thought she could love him into being better. When she finally left, she said the hardest part wasn't being afraid of him, it was being afraid of herself, of trusting her own judgment after years of being told it was worthless." Sarah absorbed this revelation, understanding that Marcus's gentleness wasn't just natural temperament, but conscious choice, a deliberate rejection of the model his father had provided. "Did she ever regret leaving?" "Never," Marcus said firmly. "She said the scariest part of freedom was realizing how small she had been living, how much of herself she had given up to keep someone else comfortable. She spent the rest of her life making up for lost time." The conversation was interrupted by the library's 5 o'clock closing announcement. Sarah realized she had spent the entire afternoon in Marcus's presence, had forgotten about David's demands and her own fear for several precious hours. The thought of returning to their apartment, of facing his anger and suspicion, made her stomach clench with anxiety. "I have to go," she said, but made no move to stand. "No," Marcus said quietly. "You choose to go. There's a difference." The distinction was subtle but profound. Sarah had spent so long operating from obligation and fear that the concept of choice felt foreign. But Marcus was right. She could choose to go home and face David's anger, Or she could choose to stay at the library until closing, then choose to go to her sister's house, or choose to call a women's shelter, or choose any number of paths that didn't lead back to the apartment where someone waited to punish her for having thoughts and feelings independent of his control. "What if I choose to stay?" she asked. "Then I'll help you figure out what staying safely looks like," Marcus replied without hesitation. For the first time in 2 years, Sarah felt the possibility of a future that didn't revolve around managing someone else's moods and expectations. The sensation was terrifying and exhilarating, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing she had wings she'd forgotten how to use. Outside, the snow continued falling, covering the city in pristine white that made everything look clean and possible. Sarah sat in the warm library next to a gentle giant who spoke in whispers and handled broken things with infinite care. And for the first time since she could remember, she began to believe that her story might have a different ending than the wind. One David had been writing for her. Sarah made her choice at 5:17 p.m., standing in the library's marble foyer while snow painted the world white beyond the tall windows. Instead of turning toward the bus stop that would take her home to David's inevitable interrogation, she pulled out her phone and dialed her sister's number with fingers that trembled only slightly. "Rebecca? It's Sarah. I need somewhere to stay tonight." Marcus stood nearby, not eavesdropping, but providing silent moral support, his presence like a lighthouse guiding ships through dangerous waters. When Sarah hung up the phone, her face carried a mixture of terror and relief that he recognized from his mother's expression the night she finally packed her suitcase. "Rebecca lives in Shadyside," Sarah said, her voice stronger than it had been all afternoon. "She's been asking me to visit for months. I always told her David and I were too busy. And now?" Marcus asked gently. "Now I'm choosing to say yes." The word choosing felt foreign on her tongue, but each time she used it, it became more familiar, more powerful. Marcus walked with her to the library's entrance, where they paused beneath the warm glow of the overhead lights. Outside, the snow was falling harder now, turning the evening into something magical and clean. Sarah realized she was about to step into that snow as a different person than she had been that morning, someone who had acknowledged her truth and taken the first step toward reclaiming her life. "Sarah," Marcus said softly, pulling a small piece of paper from his pocket, "this is my number. If you need anything, someone to talk to, someone to come get you, someone to just sit quietly with you, please call." She took the paper, there, fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. The contact was gentle, unthreatening, everything that David's touch was not. "What if calling you makes things worse? Then we'll figure out how to handle worse together," Marcus replied. "But isolation is what keeps dangerous situations dangerous. Connection is what makes change possible." 20 minutes later, Sarah stood on her sister's doorstep in Shadyside, overnight bag in hand, feeling like a refugee from her own life. Rebecca opened the door before Sarah could knock, her face creased with concern and barely restrained questions. Come in," Rebecca said, ushering Sarah into the warm interior of her craftsman-style home. "You look frozen." Rebecca Martinez Sullivan had spent 3 years watching her younger sister disappear into a relationship that seemed to drain the color from her personality. The vibrant, confident woman who had graduated law school summa cum laude had been gradually replaced by someone who apologized for having opinions and asked permission to make basic decisions. Rebecca had bitten her tongue countless times, knowing that pushing too hard might drive Sarah away entirely. "David doesn't know I'm here," Sarah said without preamble, settling onto Rebecca's couch with a cup of hot tea. "I told him I was working late at the library, but instead I spent the afternoon talking to someone who helped me see things more clearly." Rebecca's eyebrows rose. In 2 years of careful conversations, Sarah had never admitted that anything was wrong with her relationship, had defended David's controlling behavior as caring, his jealousy as love. This sudden honesty felt like a dam breaking, What kind of things? Rebecca asked carefully. Sarah pushed up her sleeves, revealing the fingerprint bruises on her wrists. Things like the fact that someone who loves you shouldn't leave marks on your body as proof of ownership. Rebecca's sharp intake of breath filled the quiet living room. As a nurse practitioner, she had seen domestic violence countless times, had been trained to recognize the signs, but seeing evidence on her own sister's body triggered a rage that took her breath away. Sarah, how long has this been happening? The hitting is new, Sarah said, surprised by her own clinical tone. But the rest? I think it's been happening so gradually that I stopped noticing when normal conversations became interrogations, when caring became controlling. They talked until midnight, Sarah describing the slow erosion of her autonomy, while Rebecca listened with the patience of someone who understood that healing conversations couldn't be rushed. Rebecca shared her own observations, how Sarah had stopped mentioning friends, had canceled family gatherings, had begun second-guessing herself in ways that weren't characteristic of her naturally confident personality. There's something else, Sarah said as they prepared for bed. I think I'm developing feelings for someone. Rebecca paused in arranging blankets on the couch. The person you talked to today? His name is Marcus. He works at the library, restoring old books. Sarah searched for words to describe someone whose presence felt like safety itself. He's the opposite of David in every way that matters. He speaks in whispers and treats damaged things with infinite care. And that scares you. Terrifies me, Sarah admitted. Not because he's dangerous, but because he makes me remember what it feels like to be treated with genuine kindness. The contrast makes my relationship with David look even worse than it already was. Meanwhile, across the city, David Kellerman was experiencing his own form of escalation. Sarah's phone had gone straight to voicemail when he called at 6 p.m. Again at 7, and twice more by 8 o'clock. By 9 p.m., his concern had transformed into the familiar fury that Sarah's independence always triggered. He drove to her office building, circling the parking garage until he confirmed her car wasn't there. The Henderson and Associates offices were dark, contradicting her claim about working late. David's mind began constructing scenarios of fears, deception, disrespect, each possibility feeding the anger that had been building since her defiant behavior at the library. At 11 p.m., he began calling Sarah's colleagues, starting with the partners at her firm. Hi, this is David, Sarah's boyfriend. I'm worried because she said she was working late, but she's not answering her phone. Is she still at the office? The responses confirmed his suspicions. Sarah hadn't been seen since her normal departure time. She had lied to him, directly and deliberately, and David's rage crystallized into cold determination. When Sarah came home, and she would come home, eventually, there would be consequences that would ensure she never felt confident enough to deceive him again. Back in Shadyside, Sarah lay awake on Rebecca's couch, staring at the ceiling and processing the day's revelations. For the first time in months, she wasn't lying rigid beside David, monitoring his breathing patterns for signs that he might wake up angry. The freedom felt surreal, like discovering she had been holding her breath for 2 years, and finally being able to exhale. Her phone, which she had silenced hours earlier, showed 17 missed calls from David. Sarah deleted them without listening to the voicemails, understanding that whatever messages he had left were designed to manipulate her back into compliance. The old Sarah would have rushed home immediately, terrified of the consequences of ignoring his calls. This Sarah, the one who had chosen to stay at the library, chosen to call Rebecca, chosen to acknowledge her truth, was learning to prioritize her safety over his comfort. Thursday morning arrived crisp and bright, the overnight snow having transformed Pittsburgh into a winter wonderland. Sarah woke on Rebecca's couch feeling more rested than she had in months, despite sleeping in an unfamiliar place. She checked her phone to find 3 new voicemails from David, each one escalating in intensity from hurt confusion to barely controlled. Rage. "We need to talk," the final message said, his voice carrying the particular tone that meant he was planning her punishment. "I'll be waiting when you get home." Rebecca emerged from her bedroom in scrubs, preparing for her morning shift. At Allegheny General Hospital, she took one look at Sarah's pale face and sat down beside her on the couch. "Bad messages?" "He knows I lied about working late. He's furious." Sarah's voice carried the automatic fear response that David's anger always triggered. "I have to go." "Back, Rebecca. If I don't, he'll what?" Rebecca interrupted gently. "What's the worst thing that could happen if you don't go back today?" Sarah opened her mouth to list the catastrophic consequences of defying David's expectations, then stopped. What exactly would happen? He would be angry, but he was already angry. He might break something, but her physical safety mattered more. Then furniture. He might threaten her, but threats only had power if she remained within reach. "I don't actually know," Sarah admitted. "I've been so afraid of making him angry that I've never tested what happens when I don't rush to fix things." "Maybe. Today's a good day to find out," Rebecca suggested. "You could stay here, go to work from here, make decisions based on what you want instead of what he demands." The suggestion felt both thrilling and terrifying. Sarah had been operating from crisis management mode for so long that the concept of making proactive choices felt revolutionary. But underneath the fear, she felt something else stirring curiosity about who she might be if she stopped performing for David's approval. At 8 a.m., Sarah called her office and told her assistant she would be working from home due to the snow. At 8:30, she sent David a text message. "I'm safe. I need some time to think. I'll contact you when I'm ready." The response came immediately. "What the hell does that mean? Where are you?" "Come home right now." Sarah turned off her phone without replying. At the library, Marcus arrived for work carrying his own anxiety about Sarah's situation. He had spent the night researching domestic violence resources, memorizing hotline numbers and shelter locations, preparing himself to offer concrete help if she reached out. The memory of her bruised wrists and frightened eyes had haunted his sleep, reminding him of his own powerlessness to rescue his mother until she was ready to save herself. Dr. Hoffman found him in the restoration room at 9 a.m., mechanically cleaning tools that were already spotless. "Did she call?" she asked without preamble. "No, but that might be good news. If she's safe enough to not need help immediately, maybe she's taking time to think through her options. And if she's not safe?" Marcus set down the brush he had been absently polishing. "Then I drive to wherever she is and remind her that she has people who care about what happens to her." Patricia studied his face, recognizing the particular combination of protectiveness and helplessness that came from watching someone you care about navigate danger. "Marcus, you can't rescue her. You can only provide support when she's ready to rescue herself." "I know," he said quietly. "But knowing doesn't make the waiting easier." At 2 p.m., Sarah's phone rang with a call from an unknown number. She answered cautiously, expecting another attempt from David to reach her through borrowed phones or work connections. "Sarah, it's Marcus. I hope it's okay that I'm calling." The sound of his gentle voice sent relief flooding through her system. "It's more." "Then okay. How did you get this number?" "You gave it to me yesterday when you called your sister," Marcus said. "I wrote it down in case." "Well, in case you need someone to remind you that choosing yourself isn't selfish." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. In the chaos of dealing with David's anger and her own fear, she had forgotten that someone else was invested in her well-being without expecting anything in return. "I stayed at Rebecca's last night. I turned off my phone this morning. How does that feel?" "Terrifying and wonderful," Sarah admitted. "Like I'm disappearing from my old life and becoming someone new." Marcus understood the sensation she was describing. "When my mother left my father, she said the hardest part wasn't being afraid of Him was being afraid that she had forgotten how to be herself without someone else's approval. I think I'm discovering that I don't actually know who I am when I'm not trying to avoid making someone angry, Sarah said. It's exciting and overwhelming at the same time. They talked for 20 minutes, Marcus providing the steady presence. That had become Sarah's anchor in the storm of her changing life. When she hung up the phone, she realized she was smiling, not the careful, placating expression she wore around David, but genuine happiness that came from being truly seen and accepted. Rebecca returned home from work to find Sarah sitting at the kitchen table, laptop open, legal documents spread across the surface. What's all this? Restraining order paperwork, Sarah said matter-of-factly. And research on tenant rights for breaking leases early due to domestic violence. Pennsylvania has some protections I didn't know about. Rebecca felt her heart swell with pride and relief. This was the sister she remembered, competent, thorough, taking control of difficult situations instead of being paralyzed by them. You're really doing this. I'm really doing this, Sarah confirmed. I called the domestic violence hotline this morning. They connected me with a counselor who specializes in safety planning. I have an appointment on Monday morning. And David? Sarah's expression grew serious. David gets to learn that loving someone doesn't give you the right to control them. And that some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt with apologies and promises. That evening, as snow continued falling outside Rebecca's windows, Sarah sat by the fireplace reading one of her sister's books, something she hadn't done for pleasure in over a year. David had always complained that her reading was antisocial, that she was ignoring him in favor of stupid stories. Tonight, she lost herself in a novel about a woman who discovered her strength by leaving everything familiar behind, and the parallel felt like a message from the universe. Her phone, which she had turned back on to check work emails, buzzed with another message from David. I drove by your sister's house. I know you're there. Stop playing games and come home. Sarah stared at the message, feeling the familiar chill of being watched and pursued. But underneath the fear, she felt something new: anger at David's assumption that he could track her movements and demand her compliance. She was no longer a possession that had wandered away from its proper place. She was a person making choices about her own life. She showed the message to Rebecca, who immediately called her husband. Tom, we need to install that security system we've been talking about. Tonight if possible. As Rebecca made arrangements to protect their home, Sarah realized that her decision to leave David wasn't just about escaping danger. It was about reclaiming her right to exist without fear, to make choices without permission, to love and be loved in ways that nurtured rather than diminished her spirit. Marcus's words echoed in her mind. Choosing yourself isn't selfish. For the first time in 2 years, Sarah was beginning to believe that might be true. Friday morning arrived with a brilliant sun that transformed the previous night's snow into thousands of tiny diamonds scattered across Pittsburgh. Sarah woke before dawn, not from anxiety but from anticipation. Today, she would return to work as herself, not as the carefully controlled version of herself that David had sculpted over 2 years of manipulation. Rebecca had already left for her early shift at the hospital, but she had left coffee brewing and a note on the kitchen counter. Remember, you are stronger than you know and braver than you feel. Call if you need anything. Love, R. Sarah dressed carefully, choosing a burgundy blouse she had loved but stopped wearing because David complained it was too attention-seeking. Looking in the mirror, she saw someone she barely recognized, the same face, but with eyes that held defiance instead of defeat, shoulders that weren't perpetually braced for criticism. Her phone showed 12 missed calls from David throughout the night, plus a series of increasingly desperate text messages that revealed his growing panic at losing control. The final message, sent at 3 a.m., carried a different tone. I'm sorry. I know I've been difficult lately. Come home and we'll talk. I'll be better, I promise. Sarah recognized the pattern: escalation followed by false remorse. the cycle that had kept her trapped for months. But this time, instead of feeling guilty for making him behave badly, she felt something close to pity. David was revealing himself to be exactly what Marcus had suggested, someone so insecure that he needed to diminish another person to feel powerful. At Henderson and Associates, Sarah's colleagues noticed the change immediately. Jennifer Walsh, her maternal colleague, stopped by Sarah's office mid-morning with an expression of pleased surprise. "You look different," Jennifer observed. "Lighter somehow." "I feel different," Sarah admitted. "I made some changes in my personal life that are helping me remember who I used to be." Jennifer's knowing smile suggested she understood more than Sarah had explicitly shared. Sometimes the best thing we can do for ourselves is stop trying to be smaller to make other people comfortable. The comment resonated deeply with Sarah, reminding her of Marcus's words about fitting into spaces that were too small. She spent the morning working on client cases with a focus and energy she hadn't felt in months, no longer distracted by the constant mental calculation of David's potential reactions to her choices. At lunchtime, instead of remaining at her desk to avoid David's inevitable phone calls, Sarah walked to the library. The familiar marble halls felt like returning to sanctuary, and when she spotted Marcus in the main reading area, carefully handling a leather-bound volume, her heart performed a small dance of recognition and gratitude. Marcus looked up as she approached, his face lighting with relief and something deeper, a warmth that made Sarah's cheeks flush with unexpected pleasure. "You came back," he said softly. "I told you I would," Sarah replied, settling into the chair across from him. "And I'm learning to keep promises to myself as well as to other people." Marcus studied her face, noting the subtle changes that indicated internal transformation. "You look like someone who slept well last night." "For the first time in months," Sarah confirmed. "It's amazing how much energy you have when you're not spending it all on crisis management." They fell into easy conversation about books, work, and the peculiar liberation that came from making choices based on personal values rather than other people's expectations. Marcus shared stories from his restoration work, a cookbook that revealed a family's immigration story through changing ingredients, a diary that chronicled a woman's journey from arranged marriage to unexpected love. "Every damaged book has a story about survival," he observed. "Some are stories about enduring difficult conditions, others about finding the courage to change those conditions." "Which kind of story am I?" Sarah asked. Marcus considered the question seriously. "I think you're writing the second kind, the really brave kind." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Hoffman, who approached their table with an expression that mixed maternal approval with professional concern. "Marcus, I hate to interrupt, but there's a situation at the front desk that requires your attention," she said. "A man is asking for information about our Tuesday and Thursday regular visitor. He seems quite agitated." Sarah's blood turned to ice water. "Tall, dark hair, probably charming when he wants to be." "That would be him," Dr. Hoffman confirmed. "He's claiming to be your boyfriend and expressing concern about your welfare." "Should I call security?" Marcus was already standing, his considerable height and protective posture making him look formidable despite his gentle nature. "I'll handle this." "Patricia, please stay with Sarah." "No," Sarah said firmly, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "This is my situation to handle. I'm not hiding anymore." She stood and walked toward the library's main entrance, Marcus and Dr. Hoffman flanking her like bodyguards. Through the tall windows, she could see David pacing in the foyer, his agitation visible in every sharp movement. When he spotted her approaching, his expression shifted rapidly through relief, anger, and calculation. Sarah pushed through the heavy doors with Marcus close behind her, close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough back to let her maintain control of the confrontation. "There you are," David said, his voice carrying forced casualness that didn't match the tension in his body. I've been worried sick. You weren't answering your phone. Your office said you were working from home. I told you I needed time to think, Sarah replied evenly. That's exactly what I've been doing. David's eyes flicked to Marcus, taking in his imposing size and protective stance. And who's this? Part of your thinking process? Sarah felt Marcus shift slightly behind her, ready to step forward if David's tone escalated further. But she also felt her own strength solidifying, the weeks of Marcus's gentle encouragement crystallizing into unshakable resolve. This is Marcus, she said calmly. He's my friend. And David, we need to talk, but not here. Fine, David snapped. Let's go home and— No, Sarah interrupted. I'm not going home with you. We can talk here, outside, with other people around, or we can talk Monday morning in a lawyer's office. Your choice. David's mask of concerned boyfriend began slipping, revealing the controlling anger underneath. What the hell has gotten into you? You're acting crazy, Sarah. First you disappear without explanation. Now you're making scenes in public with strangers. I'm acting sane for the first time in 2 years, Sarah said, her voice carrying a clarity that cut through his manipulation attempts. I'm making choices based on what I want rather than what you demand. It probably seems crazy to you because you've forgotten what I look like when I'm not afraid. Marcus watched the exchange with growing admiration for Sarah's composure and growing concern about David's barely contained rage. He could see the moment when David realized that his usual tactics, guilt, intimidation, emotional manipulation, weren't working, and something dangerous flickered across his features. You think you're better than me now? David's voice dropped to a menacing whisper. You think this oversized librarian is going to protect you? I know where you work, where your family lives. You can't hide from me, Sarah. The threat hung in the cold air between them, but instead of the fear David expected to see in Sarah's eyes, he encountered something that clearly shocked him: pity. I'm not hiding from you, David, Sarah said quietly. I'm walking away from you. There's a difference. She reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope. These are copies of the restraining order I filed this morning. The originals are being served to you at the apartment right now. You're not allowed to contact me, come to my workplace, or approach any member of my family. If you violate this order, you'll be arrested. David stared at the envelope as if it contained a live snake. You can't be serious. We're in a relationship, Sarah. You can't just decide to end it unilaterally. Watch me, Sarah replied. For a moment, David seemed to deflate, the reality of losing control hitting him like cold water. Then his expression hardened into something ugly and familiar, the look that had preceded every escalation in their relationship. You'll regret this, he said, his voice carrying a promise rather than a threat. You think you're strong enough to make it without me? You're nothing without me, Sarah. No one will ever love you the way I do. Marcus stepped forward then, his movement fluid but unmistakably protective. I think you should leave now, he said, his normally gentle voice carrying undertones of steel. David looked up at Marcus's considerable bulk and seemed to recalculate his options. Whatever he saw in Marcus's face convinced him that further escalation would be unwise. This isn't over, he said to Sarah, but he was already backing toward his car. Yes, it is, Sarah replied firmly. It's been over for a long time. I just finally had the courage to admit it. They watched David drive away, his tires squealing against the snowy pavement in a final display of impotent rage. Sarah felt her knees wobble slightly as the adrenaline began to fade, and Marcus's steadying hand on her elbow was both welcome and necessary. Are you okay? He asked softly. I'm better than okay, Sarah said, and realized she meant it. I'm free. Dr. Hoffman, who had been watching from just inside the library doors, approached with a warm smile and a thermos of hot coffee. I think this calls for a celebration, she said. Nothing fancy, just acknowledgement that watching someone reclaim their power is one of life's great privileges. They sat on a bench outside the library, sharing coffee and watching the city bustle around them. Sarah felt a profound sense of completion, as if she had just finished writing a difficult chapter and was ready to begin a new one. What happens now? Marcus asked. Sarah considered the question, realizing that for the first time in years, her answer wasn't dictated by someone else's expectations. Now I remember what it feels like to make decisions without fear. I find an apartment where I can read books without apologizing. I spend time with people who make me feel larger rather than smaller. She looked at Marcus, taking in his kind eyes and careful posture, the way he held space for her emotions without trying to fix or minimize them. And maybe I explore what it feels like to be cared for by someone who doesn't need to own me to love me. Marcus felt his heart skip at the implications of her words, but he also understood that Sarah was emerging from a traumatic situation and needed time to heal before making new emotional commitments. There's no rush, he said gently. Healing happens in its own time, at its own pace. I know, Sarah replied. But I also know that some people are worth waiting for, and some connections are worth nurturing slowly and carefully. That afternoon, Sarah returned to Rebecca's house to find her sister setting up a security system with military efficiency. Rebecca took one look at Sarah's face and immediately pulled her into a fierce hug. You did it, Rebecca said. You actually did it. I did, Sarah confirmed, still marveling at the reality of her newfound freedom. And Rebecca? I want to start seeing a therapist. I need to understand how I let things get so bad, and I want to make sure I never make those mistakes again. Rebecca's eyes filled with proud tears. I'll help you find someone good. The best trauma therapists in the city. That evening, as Sarah sat by Rebecca's fireplace reading another book for pure pleasure, her phone rang with a call from an unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. Is this Sarah Martinez? A woman's voice asked. Yes. My name is Detective Maria Santos with Pittsburgh PD. We arrested David Kellerman an hour ago for violating a restraining order. He was found parked outside your workplace after hours, apparently conducting surveillance. He's being held overnight, and there will be a hearing Monday morning. Sarah felt a mixture of vindication and relief. David's inability to respect boundaries, even legal ones, confirmed everything she had finally acknowledged about his character. Thank you for calling, Ms. Martinez. I've seen a lot of these cases over the years. What you did today, standing up to him publicly, filing the restraining order, refusing to be intimidated, that takes real courage. You should be proud of yourself. After hanging up, Sarah sat in the quiet living room processing the day's events. 6 months ago, she couldn't have imagined having the strength to confront David so directly. The transformation felt miraculous, but she understood that it hadn't been magic. It had been the gradual accumulation of small choices, gentle encouragement from people who saw her worth, and the persistent whisper of her own voice, finally growing loud enough to hear. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Thinking of you. Hope you're somewhere safe and warm tonight. Sarah smiled as she typed back, I am. In every way that matters. Outside, snow began falling again, but this time it felt like blessing rather than burden, a clean slate covering the old world and making space for whatever beautiful thing might grow in its place. 3 months after David's arrest, Sarah stood in the doorway of her new apartment on Liberty Avenue, watching Marcus carefully maneuver a restored antique bookshelf through the narrow entrance. The morning light streaming through the tall windows caught the gold threads in the shelf's leather binding holders, making them shimmer like tiny promises of stories yet to be discovered. Left a bit, Sarah called softly, unable to suppress her smile as Marcus adjusted his grip with the patient precision she had come to associate with everything he did. Perfect. The apartment was small but filled with light. its hardwood floors and exposed brick walls creating the kind of space where someone could breathe freely. Sarah had chosen it specifically because it felt like the opposite of the cramped, controlled environment she had shared with David. Here, she could arrange furniture according to her own preferences, hang art that made her happy, and read books. Until 3 in the morning, without explaining herself to anyone, Marcus set the bookshelf against the wall with a satisfied sigh, then stepped back to admire his handiwork. The piece was a masterwork of restoration, a 1920s lawyer's cabinet that he had spent weeks returning to its original glory, replacing damaged shelves and refinishing the wood until it gleamed with renewed life. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, running her fingers along the smooth surface. "You brought it back to life." "Sometimes things just need patient attention to remember what they were meant to be," Marcus replied, his words carrying the gentle wisdom that had become Sarah's anchor during the turbulent months of rebuilding her life. Sarah had been seeing Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a trauma specialist, twice weekly since David's arrest. The therapy sessions were challenging, forcing her to examine the gradual erosion of boundaries that allowed the relationship to become abusive. But they were also liberating. Each session helped her distinguish between her authentic voice and the careful performance she had developed to avoid David's anger. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop," Sarah had confessed to Dr. Rodriguez during their session the previous week. "Marcus is so different from David that part of me keeps expecting him to reveal some hidden agenda, some way he's trying to control me." "That's a normal response after psychological trauma," Dr. Rodriguez had explained. "Your nervous system learned to expect betrayal as protection. Learning to trust again takes time, especially when someone is showing you a completely different model of how relationships can function." The evidence of that different model was everywhere in Sarah's interactions with Marcus. When she mentioned wanting to take a pottery class, he researched studios and brought her brochures without insisting on joining her. When she needed to work late on a difficult case, he offered to bring her dinner, but accepted her polite refusal without hurt feelings or accusations. Most remarkably, when she told him she wasn't ready for anything beyond friendship, he had simply nodded and said, "I'm honored to be your friend for as long as you'll have me." The lack of pressure, the absence of expectation, the way Marcus seemed genuinely invested in her happiness without needing to be the source of it, these things were so foreign to Sarah's experience that they initially made her suspicious. But as weeks turned to months, Marcus's consistency began creating new neural pathways in her brain, ones that associated masculine presence with safety rather than threat. Walsh from Henderson and Associates had become another crucial ally in Sarah's healing process. As someone who had escaped her own controlling marriage 15 years earlier, Jennifer understood the peculiar challenges of rebuilding an identity that had been systematically dismantled. "Recovery isn't linear," Jennifer had told Sarah over lunch the week before. "Some days you'll feel strong and independent. Others you'll catch yourself apologizing for having preferences or second-guessing perfectly reasonable decisions. That's normal. Healing means learning to be patient with yourself while your brain rewires itself." Sarah was discovering the truth of Jennifer's words daily. Yesterday, she had caught herself asking Marcus's permission to rearrange the furniture in her own apartment, then felt embarrassed by the automatic deference. But instead of shame or frustration, Marcus had gently pointed out that seeking input from people you trust was different from requiring permission, and that learning to distinguish between the two was part of the healing process. The bookshelf installation complete, Marcus and Sarah settled on her couch with coffee and the comfortable silence that had become their signature. Outside, Pittsburgh was experiencing one of those perfect April days that made winter feel like a distant memory, and Sarah found herself marveling at how much her life had changed since those first tentative conversations in the library. "I got a call from Detective Santos yesterday," Sarah said, stirring honey into her coffee. "David's pleading guilty to the stalking charges in exchange for mandatory anger management counseling, and a longer restraining order. Marcus studied her face, looking for signs of anxiety or unresolved fear. How do you feel about that? Relieved, Sarah said honestly. I was dreading a trial, having to testify about the abuse, seeing him again. This way, it's finished. He accepts responsibility, gets help he clearly needs, and I don't have to relive the worst parts of that relationship. In a courtroom. And you feel safe with the extended restraining order? Sarah considered the question seriously. 3 months ago, she would have been terrified that David might violate legal boundaries again. But the combination of therapy, supportive relationships, and her own growing confidence had shifted her perspective fundamentally. I feel safe because I trust myself now, she said. If David showed up tomorrow, I wouldn't freeze or try to manage his emotions. I'd call the police, rely on my support system, and protect myself without hesitation. The restraining order is just paper. My real protection comes from knowing my own worth. Marcus felt something warm expand in his chest at Sarah's words. Watching her transform from the frightened woman who had flinched at his movements to this confident person who spoke about self-protection with such clarity had been one of the great privileges of his life. He had learned as much from her courage as she had from his gentleness. I have something for you, Marcus said, reaching into his jacket pocket. A housewarming gift, but also a celebration of everything you've accomplished. He handed her a small wrapped package that Sarah opened. With the careful attention she had learned from watching him handle fragile things. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages cream-colored and edged in gold, with her initials embossed on the cover in elegant script. You made this, Sarah breathed, recognizing the quality of craftsmanship that marked all of Marcus's restoration. Work. I thought you might want to document this chapter of your life, Marcus said softly. The part where you remember who you are and decide who you want to become. Sarah held the journal against her chest, feeling tears prick at her eyes. The gift was perfect in its simplicity and meaning, not something designed to impress or obligate, but something that honored her journey and supported her continued growth. Marcus, she began, then stopped, searching for words adequate to the moment. I need to tell you something. He waited with the patient attention that had become his gift to everyone around him, creating space for whatever truth she needed to share. When I first met you, I was so broken that I couldn't imagine ever feeling whole again, Sarah said. You could have taken advantage of that vulnerability, could have positioned yourself as my rescuer and made me dependent on your protection. Instead, you taught me to rescue myself. You showed me what love looks like when it's offered without conditions or expectations. Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. Sarah. Let me finish, she said gently. I'm not ready for a romantic relationship yet. I'm still learning to trust my own judgment, still figuring out who I am when I'm not performing for someone else's approval. But I want you to know that when I'm ready, if you're still interested, I can't imagine wanting to explore that with anyone else. The declaration hung in the air between them like a bridge stretching toward a future neither of them had dared to fully imagine. Marcus understood that Sarah was offering him something precious, not just the possibility of romantic love, but the promise that when she chose him, it would be from a place of strength rather than need, desire rather than desperation. I'll wait, Marcus said simply, for as long as it takes. And if that future never comes, I'll consider myself lucky to have been your friend through this transformation. Sarah leaned forward and took his large hands in her smaller ones, marveling at how safe she felt touching someone whose physical strength could have overwhelmed her, but who had chosen to use that strength only for protection and comfort. There's something else, she said. Dr. Rodriguez thinks I'm ready to start volunteering at the women's shelter, helping other women who are where I was 6 months ago. I wanted to ask if you'd be interested in volunteering too, not as my partner, but as yourself. They need men who understand that strength can be gentle, that protection doesn't require possession. Marcus felt honored by the invitation to join Sarah in work that clearly mattered deeply to her. "I'd like that very much, if they'll have me." "They'll have you," Sarah said with certainty. "The world needs more men who speak in whispers and treat broken things with infinite care." As the afternoon stretched toward evening, they worked together to arrange Sarah's books on the restored shelves, creating a library that reflected her eclectic interests and growing confidence in her own tastes. Poetry collections sat beside legal textbooks. Classic novels shared space with contemporary memoirs. Self-help books nestled comfortably next to cooking guides. Sarah planned to actually use now that she could choose her own meals. "It's funny," Sarah observed, stepping back to admire their work. 6 months ago, I was afraid to have opinions about books because David might criticize my choices. Now I have shelves full of stories I picked because they spoke to something in me." Marcus understood that she was talking about more than literature. The apartment, the books, the volunteer work, the journal, everything represented Sarah's reclamation of her right to have preferences, make choices, and build a life that reflected her authentic self rather than someone else's expectations. Dr. Hoffman stopped by in the early evening, bearing a bottle of champagne and her characteristic warmth. "I wanted to see how the shelf looked in its new home," she said, but her eyes were taking in the transformation of both the space and its owner. "It's perfect," Sarah said, meaning both the furniture and the life she was building around it. "Everything is perfect." They toasted to new beginnings, second chances, and the particular magic that happened when broken things were handled with enough care to become beautiful again. As the sun set over Pittsburgh, painting Sarah's apartment in shades of gold and amber, she felt a profound sense of completion, not the ending of her story, but the end of a chapter that had nearly destroyed her, and the beginning of one that felt full of unlimited possibility. Her phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "How's the new place?" Is the gentle giant being appropriately helpful without being overwhelming? Sarah laughed, typing back. "He's perfect. Everything is perfect. I'm perfect, flawed and healing, and exactly where I need to be." That night, after Marcus and Dr. Hoffman had gone home, Sarah sat at her new desk with the journal Marcus had made for her, writing the first entry in what she hoped would be a long record of a life lived on her own terms. "Today I moved into my own space, filled my own shelves, and chose my own future. Today I remembered that love is supposed to feel like freedom, not captivity. Today I began writing the story I want to live, one whispered word at a time." Outside her windows, Pittsburgh sparkled with the lights of 800,000 other people making their own choices, fighting their own battles, building their own versions of home. Sarah had joined their ranks, no longer a victim of someone else's story, but the author of her own. 8 months after David's arrest, Sarah stood before a mirror in the volunteer coordinator's office at Safe Harbor Women's Shelter, pinning on her name tag and taking a deep breath to calm the familiar pre-presentation nerves. Today marked her first time leading a support group for women, newly escaped from abusive relationships, a milestone that felt both terrifying and deeply meaningful. "You've got this," she whispered to her reflection, practicing the self-encouragement. Dr. Rodriguez had taught her to replace the internal criticism that had once dominated her thoughts. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the frightened person who had first sought refuge at Rebecca's house. This Sarah stood straighter, spoke with conviction, and wore her strength like a comfortable sweater rather than hiding it. To avoid making others uncomfortable, Marcus arrived at the shelter at the same time, carrying a box of handmade journals, similar to the one he had created for Sarah's housewarming. He had spent weeks crafting them during his evening hours, understanding that providing women with beautiful tools for documenting their healing journeys was another form of restoration. Work not for books this time, but for human stories that deserve to be preserved and honored. "Ready?" he asked Sarah as they signed in at the front desk, his voice carrying the gentle confidence that had become Sarah's touchstone during uncertain moments. More than ready, Sarah replied, and meant it. The months of therapy, volunteer training, and gradual healing had prepared her for this moment. The opportunity to offer other women what Marcus had once offered her, proof that gentleness existed, that healing was possible, that someone who had walked a similar path could serve as both witness and guide. The support group met in a sunlit room that deliberately felt more like a living room than an institutional space. 7 women sat in a circle, their ages ranging from early 20s to late 50s, each carrying the particular wariness that marked recent survivors of intimate partner violence. Sarah recognized the careful posture, the way they positioned themselves near exits, the subtle signs of hypervigilance that she had once worn like invisible armor. "Good morning," Sarah began, settling into her chair with the unhurried movements she had learned from watching Marcus navigate spaces respectfully. "My name is Sarah, and 8 months ago, I was sitting in a circle very much like this one, wondering if I would ever feel safe in my own skin again." The introduction immediately shifted the energy in the room. Several women straightened slightly, recognizing the authenticity in Sarah's voice. The absence of professional distance had marked her as someone who had lived the experience rather than simply studied it. "I want to start by acknowledging something that no one else may have told you yet," Sarah continued. "You are not broken. You are not damaged goods. You are survivors who made impossible choices in impossible situations, and your presence here today proves that you chose yourselves when it mattered most." Maria Gonzalez, a 28-year-old teacher who had fled her marriage 3 weeks earlier, felt tears begin to flow at Sarah's words. "I keep thinking I should have left sooner," she said quietly. "My friends don't understand why it took me so long to see what everyone else could see." Sarah nodded with the understanding that came from having wrestled with the same self-recrimination. "I spent months torturing myself with that same question. Why didn't I leave after the first time he grabbed me? Why didn't I recognize the red flags that seem so obvious now?" But therapy taught me that asking, "Why didn't I leave sooner?" is the wrong question. The right question is, what gave me the strength to leave it all? Around the circle, several women nodded in recognition. This was the perspective shift that marked the beginning of healing, moving from self-blame to self-compassion, from focusing on perceived failures to celebrating survival. "Tell us about that strength," said Linda Washington, a 52-year-old nurse whose husband had controlled every aspect of her life for 15 years. "Because right now, I feel like everything that made me strong before got beaten out of me." Sarah smiled with the warmth of someone who remembered feeling exactly the same way. "The strength was always there, Linda. It just got buried under years of being told it didn't exist. My strength showed up in tiny ways, at first choosing to read books he didn't approve of, taking lunch breaks at the library instead of rushing home, calling my sister when he was at work. Each small act of self-determination was practice for the bigger acts that eventually saved my life." As the session continued, Sarah guided the women through exercises designed to help them identify moments of resistance and self-preservation in their own stories. She watched as they began to reframe their narratives, moving from seeing themselves as victims who had endured abuse to survivors who had protected themselves in whatever ways they could manage. Meanwhile, in the shelter's workshop room, Marcus was leading his own session with a smaller group women who were ready to learn practical skills for rebuilding their lives. Today's focus was basic home repair, knowledge that could help them feel more confident in maintaining independent living spaces without relying on others for every minor issue. "The most important thing about using any tool," Marcus explained, demonstrating how to properly hold a screwdriver, "is understanding that it's meant to help you accomplish something, not to intimidate you. Tools should feel like extensions of your capability, not symbols of what you can't do." Rachel Stevens, a 35-year-old accountant whose ex-husband had deliberately kept her ignorant of household maintenance to increase her dependence on him, found unexpected satisfaction in successfully hanging a picture frame on her first try. "He always told me I was too clumsy for this kind of work," she said, admiring her handiwork. "He was wrong about that," Marcus replied gently. "Just like he was wrong about a lot of other things. Your hands are perfectly capable of building the life you want." The parallel between Marcus's tool workshop and Sarah's support group was intentional. Both focused on helping women reclaim agency that had been systematically undermined. Sarah helped them rebuild emotional confidence while Marcus provided practical skills. But both approaches emphasized the same fundamental truth. These women possessed innate capabilities that had been hidden rather than destroyed. Lunch break, Sarah and Marcus sat together in the shelter's small garden, decompressing from the intensity of the morning sessions. The October air carried the crisp promise of winter, and the changing leaves created a backdrop of gold and crimson that felt like nature's own testimony to the beauty of transformation. "How did your first group leadership go?" Marcus asked, offering Sarah half of his sandwich in the automatic gesture of care that had become second nature between them. "Emotional but good," Sarah replied, accepting the food and the comfort it represented. "There's something powerful about watching women realize they're not alone in their experiences. Maria started crying when I told them they weren't broken. And by the end of the session, she was helping Linda identify moments when she had shown courage." Marcus smiled at the image of healing creating more healing. The way recovery seemed to multiply when people in similar situations supported each other. Rachel fixed a loose cabinet handle today and looked like she had conquered Mount Everest. Her ex-husband convinced her she was helpless with anything mechanical. "It's amazing how systematically they work to undermine our confidence," Sarah observed. "David convinced me I was too emotional to make good decisions, too naive to understand how the world really worked, too dependent to survive on my own. Watching these women rediscover their competence reminds me how much of my own strength I had forgotten." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Rodriguez, who had come to observe Sarah's first group leadership session. Elena had been treating domestic violence survivors for 12 years, and she possessed an uncanny ability to recognize when someone had truly integrated their healing rather than simply performing recovery. "I watched the last 15 minutes of your session," Elena said, settling onto the garden bench beside Sarah. "You found your calling, haven't you?" Sarah considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, she couldn't have imagined having enough emotional stability to support other people's healing. Today, leading the group had felt as natural as breathing, a perfect synthesis of her legal training, personal experience, and hard-won wisdom about recovery. "I think I have," Sarah agreed. "It feels like everything I went through with David, all the pain and confusion and gradual awakening, was preparing me to help other women navigate the same journey more quickly and with less self-blame." "That's how trauma becomes meaningful," Elena observed. "When we transform our wounds into wisdom that serves others." "You're not just a survivor anymore, Sarah. You're a guide." The afternoon session brought new challenges as Sarah worked with women who were still in the early stages of recognizing their situations as abusive. Unlike the morning group, which consisted of women who had already left dangerous relationships, this group included several who were still deciding whether their partner's behavior constituted abuse or just relationship problems. "He doesn't hit me," said Amanda Price, a 26-year-old graphic designer whose husband monitored her phone calls and criticized her appearance daily. "He just wants to know where I am all the time because he loves me so much." Sarah recognized her former self in Amanda's careful justifications, the way she had once defended David's possessiveness as evidence of his deep feelings for her. "Can I ask you something, Amanda? When you think about spending time with friends or pursuing a hobby he doesn't share, what do you feel in your body?" Amanda's face went through a series of micro-expressions: confusion, recognition, and finally a deep sadness. "Anxious," she admitted quietly. I feel anxious and guilty, like I'm betraying him somehow. That feeling is your intuition telling you something important, Sarah said gently. Love doesn't make you anxious about having your own interests. Love celebrates your independence, encourages your growth, trusts your judgment. What you're describing sounds more like ownership than love. The session continued with Sarah carefully planting seeds of awareness without pushing too hard or too fast. She had learned from her own experience that recognition of abuse couldn't be forced. It had to emerge organically as women developed the emotional safety to acknowledge truths they had been trained to deny. By the end of the day, Sarah felt emotionally exhausted but deeply fulfilled. Driving home to her apartment, she reflected on how completely her relationship with her own story had transformed. The pain David had caused her was still real, still part of her history, but it no longer defined her. Instead, it had become raw material for building something beautiful, a life dedicated to helping other women discover their own strength and worth. Marcus was waiting on her doorstep when she arrived home, holding takeout containers from their favorite Thai restaurant and wearing the gentle smile that never failed to make her feel like she was exactly where she belonged. Thought you might be too tired to cook after your first day as a group leader, he said, standing as she approached. How do you feel? Sarah paused before answering, taking inventory of her emotional state with the self-awareness that therapy had taught her. Tired but energized. Sad about how much pain exists in the world, but hopeful about how much healing is possible. Grateful that my worst experiences have become tools for creating better experiences for others. They settled at Sarah's kitchen table, sharing pad thai and spring rolls while Sarah described the day's sessions in detail. Marcus listened with the complete attention that had first drawn her to him, asking thoughtful questions and offering insights from his own work with the shelter's practical skills program. I keep thinking about what you said months ago, Sarah said as they cleaned up the dinner dishes together. About damaged books having stories of survival. I think I understand now what my survival story is. Marcus paused in loading the dishwasher, giving her his full attention. What is it? It's about learning that love is supposed to be a conversation, not a monologue, Sarah said thoughtfully. David loved the idea of me, the version he could control and shape according to his needs. But you love the reality of me, messy and complicated, and still figuring things out. You love me enough to let me grow, even if that growth takes me in directions you hadn't expected. The word love hung in the air between them, the first time either had used it explicitly, despite months of careful courtship and deepening affection. Marcus felt his heart perform a small dance of recognition and hope. I do love you, he said simply. All of you. The strength and the vulnerability, the confidence and the uncertainty, the woman you are today and whoever you're becoming tomorrow. Sarah stepped closer to him, close enough to see the gold flecks in his brown eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his large frame. For the first time since they had met, she didn't measure the distance between them in terms of safety and threat, but in terms of connection and possibility. I love you too, she said, her voice carrying the wonder of someone discovering a truth. That felt both surprising and inevitable. And Marcus? I think I'm ready to stop whispering. He cupped her face in his large hands with the gentleness he brought to everything precious and fragile. Are you sure? I'm sure, Sarah replied, and for the first time in her adult life, she meant it completely. I'm ready to love out loud. When he kissed her, it was with the same careful reverence he showed damaged manuscripts, as if she were something precious that deserved to be handled with infinite care. But there was also passion in the kiss, desire tempered with patience, love expressed through touch that asked permission rather than demanding compliance. Outside Sarah's windows, Pittsburgh sparkled, with the lights of hundreds of thousands of people navigating their own journeys toward wholeness and connection. Inside her apartment, two people who had learned to love in whispers were discovering what it sounded like when healing finally found its voice. 8 months after David's arrest, Sarah stood before a mirror in the volunteer coordinator's office. At Safe Harbor Women's Shelter, pinning on her name tag and taking a deep breath to calm the familiar pre-presentation nerves. Today marked her first time leading a support group for women newly escaped from abusive relationships, a milestone that felt both terrifying and deeply meaningful. "You've got this," she whispered to her reflection, practicing the self-encouragement Dr. Rodriguez had taught her, to replace the internal criticism that had once dominated her thoughts. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the frightened person who had first sought refuge at Rebecca's house. This Sarah stood straighter, spoke with conviction, and wore her strength like a comfortable sweater rather than hiding it. To avoid making others uncomfortable, Marcus arrived at the shelter at the same time, carrying a box of handmade journals, similar to the one he had created for Sarah's housewarming. He had spent weeks crafting them during his evening hours, understanding that providing women with beautiful tools for documenting their healing journeys was another form of restoration. Work not for books this time, but for human stories that deserve to be preserved and honored. "Ready?" he asked Sarah as they signed in at the front desk, his voice carrying the gentle confidence that had become Sarah's touchstone during uncertain moments. "More than ready," Sarah replied, and meant it. The months of therapy, volunteer training, and gradual healing had prepared her for this moment, the opportunity to offer other women what Marcus had once offered her, proof that gentleness existed, that healing was possible, that someone who had walked a similar path could serve as both witness and guide. The support group met in a sunlit room that deliberately felt more like a living room than an institutional space. 7 women sat in a circle, their ages ranging from early 20s to late 50s, each carrying the particular wariness that marked recent survivors of intimate partner violence. Sarah recognized the careful posture, the way they positioned themselves near exits, the subtle signs of hypervigilance that she had once worn like invisible armor. "Good morning," Sarah began, settling into her chair with the unhurried movements she had learned from watching Marcus navigate spaces respectfully. "My name is Sarah, and 8 months ago, I was sitting in a circle very much like this one, wondering if I would ever feel safe in my own skin again." The introduction immediately shifted the energy in the room. Several women straightened slightly, recognizing the authenticity in Sarah's voice, the absence of professional distance that marked her as someone who had lived the experience rather than simply studied it. "I want to start by acknowledging something that no one else may have told you yet," Sarah continued. "You are not broken. You are not damaged goods. You are survivors who made impossible choices in impossible situations, and your presence here today proves that you chose yourselves when it mattered most." Maria Gonzalez, a 28-year-old teacher who had fled her marriage 3 weeks earlier, felt tears begin to flow at Sarah's words. "I keep thinking I should have left sooner," she said quietly. "My friends don't understand why it took me so long to see what everyone else could see." Sarah nodded with the understanding that came from having wrestled with the same self-recrimination. "I spent months torturing myself with that same question. Why didn't I leave after the first time he grabbed me? Why didn't I recognize the red flags that seem so obvious now? But therapy taught me that asking, 'Why didn't I leave sooner?' is the wrong question. The right question is, what gave me the strength to leave it all?" Around the circle, several women nodded in recognition. This was the perspective shift that marked the beginning of healing, moving from self-blame to self-compassion, from focusing on perceived failures to celebrating survival. "Tell us about that strength," said Linda Washington, a 52-year-old nurse whose husband had controlled every aspect of her life for 15 years. "Because right now, I feel like everything that made me strong before got beaten out of me." Sarah smiled with the warmth of someone who remembered feeling exactly the same way. "The strength was always there, Linda. It just got buried under years of being told it didn't exist." My strength showed up in tiny ways, at first choosing to read books he didn't approve of, taking lunch breaks at the library instead of rushing home, calling my sister when he was at work. Each small act of self-determination was practice for the bigger acts that eventually saved my life. As the session continued, Sarah guided the women through exercises designed to help them identify moments of resistance and self-preservation in their own stories. She watched as they began to reframe their narratives, moving from seeing themselves as victims who had endured abuse to survivors who had protected themselves in whatever ways they could manage. Meanwhile, in the shelter's workshop room, Marcus was leading his own session with a smaller group of women who were ready to learn practical skills for rebuilding their lives. Today's focus was basic home repair, knowledge that could help them feel more confident in maintaining independent living spaces without relying on others for every minor issue. The most important thing about using any tool, Marcus explained, demonstrating how to properly hold a screwdriver, is understanding that it's meant to help you accomplish something, not to intimidate you. Tools should feel like extensions of your capability, not symbols of what you can't do. Rachel Stevens, a 35-year-old accountant whose ex-husband had deliberately kept her ignorant of household maintenance to increase her dependence on him, found unexpected satisfaction in successfully hanging a picture frame on her first try. "He always told me I was too clumsy for this kind of work," she said, admiring her handiwork. "He was wrong about that," Marcus replied gently. "Just like he was wrong about a lot of other things. Your hands are perfectly capable of building the life you want." The parallel between Marcus's tool workshop and Sarah's support group was intentional. Both focused on helping women reclaim agency that had been systematically undermined. Sarah helped them rebuild emotional confidence while Marcus provided practical skills. But both approaches emphasized the same fundamental truth. These women possessed innate capabilities that had been hidden rather than destroyed. Lunch break, Sarah and Marcus sat together in the shelter's small garden, decompressing from the intensity of the morning sessions. The October air carried the crisp promise of winter, and the changing leaves created a backdrop of gold and crimson that felt like nature's own testimony to the beauty of transformation. "How did your first group leadership go?" Marcus asked, offering Sarah half of his sandwich in the automatic gesture of care that had become second nature between them. "Emotional but good," Sarah replied, accepting the food and the comfort it represented. "There's something powerful about watching women realize they're not alone in their experiences. Maria started crying when I told them they weren't broken. And by the end of the session, she was helping Linda identify moments when she had shown courage." Marcus smiled at the image of healing creating more healing. The way recovery seemed to multiply when people in similar situations supported each other. Rachel fixed a loose cabinet handle today and looked like she had conquered Mount Everest. Her ex-husband convinced her she was helpless with anything mechanical. "It's amazing how systematically they work to undermine our confidence," Sarah observed. "David convinced me I was too emotional to make good decisions, too naive to understand how the world really worked, too dependent to survive on my own." Watching these women rediscover their competence reminds me how much of my own strength I had forgotten. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Rodriguez, who had come to observe Sarah's first group leadership session. Elena had been treating domestic violence survivors for 12 years, and she possessed an uncanny ability to recognize when someone had truly integrated their healing rather than simply performing recovery. "I watched the last 15 minutes of your session," Elena said, settling onto the garden bench beside Sarah. "You've found your calling, haven't you?" Sarah considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, she couldn't have imagined having enough emotional stability to support other people's healing. Today, leading the group had felt as natural as breathing, a perfect synthesis of her legal training, personal experience, and hard-won wisdom about recovery. "I think I have," Sarah agreed. It feels like everything I went through with David, all the pain and confusion and gradual awakening, was preparing me to help other women navigate the same journey more quickly and with less self-blame. That's how trauma becomes meaningful. Elena observed. When we transform our wounds into wisdom that serves others. You're not just a survivor anymore, Sarah. You're a guide. The afternoon session brought new challenges as Sarah worked with women who were still in the early stages of recognizing their situations as abusive. Unlike the morning group, which consisted of women who had already left dangerous relationships, this group included several who were still deciding whether their partner's behavior constituted abuse or just relationship problems. He doesn't hit me, said Amanda Price, a 26-year-old graphic designer whose husband monitored her phone calls and criticized her appearance daily. He just wants to know where I am all the time because he loves me so much. Sarah recognized her former self in Amanda's careful justifications. The way she had once defended David's possessiveness as evidence of his deep feelings for her. Can I ask you something, Amanda? When you think about spending time with friends or pursuing a hobby he doesn't share, what do you feel in your body? Amanda's face went through a series of micro-expressions, confusion, recognition, and finally a deep sadness. Anxious, she admitted quietly. I feel anxious and guilty, like I'm betraying him somehow. That feeling is your intuition telling you something important, Sarah said gently. Love doesn't make you anxious about having your own interests. Love celebrates your independence, encourages your growth, trusts your judgment. What you're describing sounds more like ownership than love. The session continued with Sarah carefully planting seeds of awareness without pushing too hard or too fast. She had learned from her own experience that recognition of abuse couldn't be forced. It had to emerge organically as women developed the emotional safety to acknowledge truths they had been trained to deny. By the end of the day, Sarah felt emotionally exhausted but deeply fulfilled. Driving home to her apartment, she reflected on how completely her relationship with her own story had transformed. The pain David had caused her was still real, still part of her history, but it no longer defined her. Instead, it had become raw material for building something beautiful, a life dedicated to helping other women discover their own strength and worth. Marcus was waiting on her doorstep when she arrived home, holding takeout containers from their favorite Thai restaurant and wearing the gentle smile that never failed to make her feel like she was exactly where she belonged. Thought you might be too tired to cook after your first day as a group leader, he said, standing as she approached. How do you feel? Sarah paused before answering, taking inventory of her emotional state with the self-awareness that therapy had taught her, tired but energized. Sad about how much pain exists in the world, but hopeful about how much healing is possible. Grateful that my worst experiences have become tools for creating better experiences for others. They settled at Sarah's kitchen table, sharing pad thai and spring rolls while Sarah described the day's sessions in detail. Marcus listened with the complete attention that had first drawn her to him, asking thoughtful questions and offering insights from his own work with the shelter's practical skills program. I keep thinking about what you said months ago, Sarah said as they cleaned up the dinner dishes together. About damaged books having stories of survival. I think I understand now what my survival story is. Marcus paused in loading the dishwasher, giving her his full attention. What is it? It's about learning that love is supposed to be a conversation. Not a monologue, Sarah said thoughtfully. David loved the idea of me, the version he could control and shape according to his needs. But you love the reality of me, messy and complicated and still figuring things out. You love me enough to let me grow, even if that growth takes me in directions you hadn't expected. The word love hung in the air between them, the first time either had used it explicitly despite months of careful courtship and deepening affection. Marcus felt his heart perform a small dance of recognition and hope. I do love you, he said simply. All of you. The strength and the vulnerability, the confidence and the uncertainty. The woman you are today and whoever you're becoming tomorrow. Sarah stepped closer to him, close enough to see the gold flecks in his brown eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his large frame. For the first time since they had met, she didn't measure the distance between them in terms of safety and threat, but in terms of connection and possibility. "I love you too," she said, her voice carrying the wonder of someone discovering a truth that felt both surprising and inevitable. "And Marcus? I think I'm ready to stop whispering." He cupped her face in his large hands with the gentleness he brought to everything precious and fragile. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," Sarah replied, and for the first time in her adult life, she meant it completely. "I'm ready to love out loud." When he kissed her, it was with the same careful reverence he showed damaged manuscripts, as if she were something precious that deserved to be handled with infinite care. But there was also passion in the kiss, desire tempered with patience, love expressed through touch that asked permission rather than demanding compliance. Outside Sarah's windows, Pittsburgh sparkled, with the lights of hundreds of thousands of people navigating their own journeys toward wholeness and connection. Inside her apartment, two people who had learned to love in whispers were discovering what it sounded like when healing finally found its voice. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.